So thanks for coming, and thanks to Alice for inviting us and to this beautiful, beautiful space, really gorgeous building. So this is part of a celebration of the 75th anniversary of Forum 49, which was, you probably know, but it was the summer of 1949. Provincetown became kind of ground zero for the abstract expressionists and modern architects and just modernists in general. And there was these summer-long Thursday night events, lectures, and exhibits. And one of those nights was about the directions of modern architecture, which included Marcel Breuer, Peter Blake, who at the time was the curator for architecture and design at MoMA, Serge Chermayeff, Kepes, György Kepes. So anyway, we don't have a recording of what they said or a transcript of it. So we're going to be talking about sort of what was in the air at the time. You can tell from their other lectures and writings of that time what they were thinking about, what were the big issues of the day. So we're going to be examining that from different angles. Can people see this screen? Everybody see that? Okay. So, and how many people were on the tour this afternoon? Okay, so we had a few. So we did a tour this afternoon of the Kugel-Gips house by Charlie Zender, the Weidlinger house, and the Breuer house, which is, so the coincidence here is that this is also the 75th anniversary of Marcel Breuer's house in Wellfleet, which was finished in 1949, and it coincides with the Cape Cod Modern House Trust's attempts to buy and restore the building. So we are closing on June 28th. We've been raising money for the last year, and we are closing. So that process will start. Construction will start in July. So I'm going to talk a bit about Breuer, a little bit about Blake and Chermayeff and the others. So Marcel Breuer was a very precocious teenager, came from a provincial city in Hungary, Pest, and he originally enrolled in a school of art in Berlin. He got there, he found it very traditional, and he saw a flyer for the Bauhaus, and he dropped out and he went to the Bauhaus and he got there. He was the youngest student there. So at 18, he arrives in 1920. And within a few years, he had really invented tubular steel furniture and just created this amazing array of incredible output of furniture designs. This is him sitting probably 1925 in the Vasily chair, which is one of his most famous and most reproduced pieces. You can see it's at the time, in the time when these people grew up in the Victorian era when there was overstuffed furniture. The Vasily chair is really like a club chair that has been vaporized and dematerialized. And so the structure is tubular steel, this was inspired by him seeing bicycle handlebars and realizing that these very thin shapes could be extremely strong. So the structure is stainless steel tube, and then the part that the body comes in contact with is always a natural material. So it's fabric, leather, wicker, wood. So there's this dichotomy from the beginning with his work of the functional structural part and then the sort of folkloric part or the natural part. His most famous chair is the Cheska chair, actually given that name later as a sort of advertising thing by Knoll Furniture. But this is probably the most reproduced chair in human history. You can find them anywhere. You can get them for $20 knockoff. This is a leather version. But a very radical idea at the time, which is that you could cantilever out over space. It's sort of the minimal, the smallest, the most minimal amount of material to make a functional chair. So again, you have this natural hand wrought material with a sewn leather, which is the part that you come in contact with. This is very much also kind of an embodiment of the Bauhaus philosophy, which was to reconcile mass production and the tradition of handcraft. So Breuer made this kind of tongue-in-cheek film strip as a project at the Bauhaus in 1925, where he has his chairs sort of, cataloging the progress of furniture design. And then the last one is the future beyond 1925, and this person is basically sitting on a cushion of air. So the chair disappears, and the person is just floating. So this is kind of, it's funny and it's kind of surrealist, but it's also he had a kind of yearning to actually transcend gravity and the time-space continuum. So 1927, soon after, he had not actually studied architecture because he was at the Bauhaus before they had an architecture program. So, but he was learning by osmosis. And in 1927, he did this unbuilt project called the Bombos Housing Project, which were live workspaces, prefabricated. This is a rendering. They were never built, but that's a digital rendering. So here you have this extreme lightness, extreme thinness. These were made out of asbestos cement panels. And this appearance of this sort of rigging, or these masts and cables, which are really like ship's rigging. So he had his relationship with vernacular architecture is always, it's interesting because it wasn't so much domestic architecture, vernacular architecture. It was more ships and mercantile and maritime architecture that he was inspired by. You can see here that this building probably doesn't work. The columns are too thin. It's sort of a he's gone a bit far in this. He's young, yeah. And then so in the mid-20s, at the same time that Breuer's doing this, the European modern architecture, typified by Corbusier. And that generation it's white, it's cubic, it's made of masonry and steel. It's sort of this typical look of European early modernism. Ribbon windows. So Corbusier's 5 rules of architecture is you should be up off the ground on pilotis or columns. There should be a roof terrace, ribbon windows, and an open plan and open facade facilitated by the columns carrying the weight of the building so that the walls are free to be whatever they want to be. He violated all these rules very soon after this, but at the time. So this is an early villa that Breuer did in 1931 in Germany, and it's a kind of a typical early modern building. White ribbon windows, masonry, and these sort of appendages. They were, this generation was obsessed with sunshine and the outdoors. This was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, where people are in factories all day. And there's this kind of sun worshipping that they got in trouble in Weimar in the first Bauhaus, for they were always swimming naked in the river and sunbathing and stuff. So this was part of the ethos, is to always have these big terraces. So Breuer and Gropius and most of the rest of the Bauhaus faculty and students all fled Germany with the rise of Nazism. And Breuer and Gropius end up in Massachusetts at the base of Cape Cod in 1937. So Gropius takes over the Harvard architecture department and creates the Graduate School of Design. And Breuer is the main teacher in that school. So he was the main teacher for the great generation of modern architects that came after it. So as part of that, Breuer and Gropius were given land in Lincoln and a budget to build themselves houses. So this is the Gropius house, 1938. 1938. 39. Yeah. 38, 39, 38. Anyway, this I like these photos of the house because you can see it's sort of it's a cubic. It's a sort of white cube that's been eroded and had pieces taken away. So it's sort of a subtractive design with this screen porch and an entry, a canopy that extend out. It has a lot of features of New England traditional architecture. It's white, cedar that's been painted, although it's run vertically instead of horizontally. It's actually the plan. I don't have the plan here, but you enter in the middle and there's a stairway, and it's actually organized like a traditional New England house. And then also it's got a lot of features of mass-produced industrial products. So this is if you haven't been, it's an unbelievable museum owned by Historic New England that's completely furnished exactly as though the Gropius has just left, and it's an incredible place. So the factory made sort of off-the-shelf items are the spiral staircase, the glass block, which was very revolutionary to be using in a house at the time. At least in this country, these steel pipe columns, the steel ribbon windows. I think of this as sort of a New England house seen through a kaleidoscope, because you've got, it's white, it's got black windows, but it's something new. This is an interior. So Ati Gropius, who was a dear friend who lived in Wellfleet at the end of her life, was the main consultant for putting this house back exactly the way it was when they lived there. So you have all this Breuer furniture and artwork from the Bauhaus. On the second floor hallway, actually, these are clapboards that are running vertically. And then cork flooring, and I think there's actually cork on the ceiling, isn't it? Look, the ceiling is some material like cork. Might possibly for sound absorption reasons, but also cork flooring was like an industrial product. All of these things have become totally normal, but in 1938, 39, they were very radical. So Breuer's house next door, he was a bachelor at the time. It was very small. Kind of an amazing building as well. There's one huge room with a very tall ceiling with a very small footprint. That's the plan there. So both the Breuer and Gropius houses were sort of demonstration houses for the architects to show potential clients to get work. This was they just landed. They want to get projects, and so this is sort of like a Whitman sampler of all of the things that they have to offer. Breuer, this is a very small house with a lot of really interesting spatial things. The main room is actually a rhomboid shape with a concave fieldstone wall. And there's all these different levels. You enter at a 3 steps below, where there's a kitchen and a dining room, and then you come up, and the stairway is hidden behind a bookcase, and there's all of these sort of screens and layers. It's a really fascinating space. So when I was in high school, one of my best friend's fathers bought this house, and so I actually got to spend a lot of time there. And then when I was starting architecture school, night school, I was a carpenter on one of the additions to this house. So I got to actually work on this house. So anyway, I've been chasing Breuer for a long time. This is Breuer and his wife Connie, who was from Salem. She was a secretary in the Breuer Gropey's office in Cambridge, and they got married and moved out fairly soon afterwards. This is just the space there with somebody lying across the bookcase. Connie's trying to get a drag of her cigarette. So Breuer, the Breuer Gropey's office does a bunch of home commissions. Breuer had a complicated relationship with Gropius. He was always trying to sort of assert himself. And in 1941, he does this house, the Chamberlain House in Wayland, which is definitely a departure. It's unpainted wood. It's using these, it has a fieldstone plinth. So there's this sort of massive masonry base, and then this very light wood frame sort of box is on top of it. And there's a real dichotomy between heavy and light here. So it's interesting that this house is in the floodplain of the Sudbury River, right? So actually this whole plain has flooded before. I think he had that in mind because the ground floor can flood, and it almost looks like in an emergency you could like unbolt it and that would float away. His first house for himself in New Canaan, which is, I forget all these names. So the 46. Breuer 1 in New Canaan, you can see he's got these cables. He has these sort of nautical things, airplane cable, and this staircase that is almost totally disappeared. It's just this sort of spider web of steel, and the treads are floating. So again, he has this sort of gravity-defying impulse. I think he was hoping that this stairway would help brace this porch, and it actually failed during construction. So he often pushed these things too far, and these cables gave way. Elliot Noyes was actually the architect in charge of the construction, and he built, and Breuer was away in Argentina, and he wrote a letter to Breuer saying, "What should I do?" And he said, "Put a fieldstone wall under it." So he built a masonry wall. But you can see he's working with these very kind of industrial elements. This is the Starkey House in Minnesota, done later, but you can see these railings where he's got cables and these sort of tension structures holding these cables. There's handrails that seem to be floating. So I think that work by Breuer is one of the sort of early inspirations of the high-tech, what became sort of high-tech modernism. The great shrine of that, of course, is the Charles and Ray Eames House in Pacific Palisades, 1951. Let's see, yes, 49, which is completely made of prefabricated factory-made panels, assembled in this extremely light way. So with the Eames house, you could say the box is the prefab light industrial part, and then the interior is all sort of hand-woven rugs and Mexican little dolls and all kinds of handmade things from all around the world. So one of the other speakers was Peter Blake, also German emigre, and turn off your phones, everybody. This is a house he did in the Hamptons as a collaboration with the painter Jackson Pollock. So in the original conception, these four walls which slide, they were all supposed to be, each one is supposed to be a mural by Jackson Pollock. So it was really 4 paintings that would move. And when the walls were all out, it would just be a floor and a roof. So again, there's this real impulse to dematerialize completely. The building almost disappears. This was built and it's still in existence. It's one of the Hamptons houses. We were just talking with somebody about the Hamptons, that these little modernist experimental houses are getting torn down at a very rapid rate. And there was a George Nelson house demolished last year in the Hamptons, and the land sold for $73 million. So the land is $73 million. So it's not, the Cape's not there yet, but we're getting there. So Breuer and Peter Blake wrote a book, Sun and Shadow, or Sol y Sombra, 1955, which is called The Philosophy of an Architect, where he talks about Breuer, and this is from a series of interviews he did with Breuer, where Breuer's talking about this unity of opposites, basically, sun and shadow, that you have to have both, not sun or shadow. And this pertains to sort of the unity of the reconciliation of opposites. So light, heavy, dark, light, man-made, industrially produced. The modernists had come out to Wellfleet. This is 1945. This is Kepes on the right, and Chermayeff and Bernard Rudofsky collaborating on books and exhibits and working on all kinds of projects together. Rudofsky curated this very important exhibit called Architecture Without Architects at MoMA, which was about world vernacular architecture. Very influential when I was in school. So Chermayeff had already arrived out in Wellfleet and was doing these very lightweight kind of modular, not prefab, but very simple buildings made of plywood and homosote. And there's 7 of these still in existence. They've all mostly been added onto or winterized. But again, you have this extreme lightness, and you could say, he's using balloon framing and some kind of nautical flag motifs and things. There's aspects of vernacular. So when Breuer came to Wellfleet to visit Chermayeff in the early 40s, and the things he would have seen in Wellfleet are things like the oyster houses that were in the harbor still. So this is a wooden box up on piers. He would have seen the South Wellfleet Fire Tower, which I'm sure he would have be very interested in, because it looks like this is built in, in 57. No, I'm sorry. It was built in, I think it was built in 27, actually. So this is still there. So when he got here in the early 40s, it definitely was already here. This looks kind of like a Russian constructivist, tower for giving speeches off of. But Breuer, I'm sure would have appreciated the tectonics of it. 49. So Breuer buys land and he builds. He designs his house and finishes it in 1949. And 49 was a very big year for him. It's when he did his MoMA house in the garden. So this is a demonstration house he built in the garden at the Museum of Modern Art in the sculpture yard, seen by hordes of people, very influential, and got him, kind of really kickstarted his career into getting a lot of bigger projects, public buildings. So when he got here in the early 40s, he bought this 24 acres and originally wanted to do a sort of cottage colony. This is the first idea he had for the longhouse. Again, suspended from these cables. This is before the New Canaan house had failed. So there's the original design. When he built it, it was the porch was actually enclosed and into a screen porch. So this is circa 1950. This is the Wise house. So he ended up building 4 versions of this house in Wellfleet. This is an interior from Life magazine. When he originally built the house, it was very simple. There were tatami mats on the floor and mattress on the floor. There was almost no furniture, just a picnic table. So that's on the right is the original building, 1949. In the center is the studio built in 61. And on the left is the apartment with the dark room built in 67. And this is a rendering of the whole house. So as he inhabited the building, he added more furniture. He loved cement blocks, and the cement blocks were always moving around and taking different shapes as indoor and outdoor architecture. He made a lot of these rugs with his wife, Connie, and at first they actually wove them themselves. So they did this with the Calders and a few other families, and then after a while they were commercially made. So the house has sat pretty much unchanged since Breuer's death in 1981. And the son, Tom, is now 80 and decided finally to sell it. It's in quite serious disrepair, but everything is still there. So it's now 4.2 acres. When the park came in, they let them keep 4.2. And it's got frontage on 3 ponds and the beginning of the Herring River. This is a painting by Peter Watts, the Wellfleet painter, of the 3 ponds that you can see from the house. So the house is in disrepair, and it's some of its lowest points were here, where it was covered with moss and the siding was falling off. 2 big trees have fallen on the house over the years. Without doing much damage, actually, because the root balls kept them from falling, they fell in slow motion. So the house is a mess, but as I say, everything is there. The mass-produced furniture, as well as furniture he made for the house. Some amazing art. There's 2 Paul Clays. There's a Albers wood block. There's a Calder painting, which unfortunately we lost in the last round of negotiations. So yes, yeah, it's Calder did it while he was staying in the house, and it was for Connie, and so anyway. But we did get the Paul Clays, and we also comes with the house is over 1,000 rolls of film taken by Tom Breuer. So this is really amazing documentation of the town and the social life and the house from the sort of mid-60s to mid-80s. So these pictures, they're kind of a very evocative illustration of the landscape in particular. This is looking south toward Newcomb Hollow from Black Pond Road. And all of this land is gone. It's all eroded, including this road is no longer there. This is sort of the driveway, sort of the woods back before the pines were very large. And then the house in the landscape. So this is the side of the house looking toward Williams Pond. Looking west. This is the entry porch, and so this is the porch with this porch is made of 2x6s that are on the flat that are supported every 6 feet. And so we are now in the process of trying to figure out how to replicate some of these things that will come close to meeting code, which is a challenge. These pictures are very important because, like in this photo, this wall apparently was rotting, and instead of replacing the wall, Breuer made it a window. And we have the dates on there, so we know exactly. But the first one was 1970, and then there's 1971. So there's a record of when that actually happened. It's the deck, looking out the window. This is sort of early on when the furniture was very low, very sort of like Japanese traditional architecture. And then this is the 800-pound table that's made of an enormous piece of slate and cement blocks with no attachments. It's just all gravity. So it's interesting because you have, in some cases, like one of his chairs that weighs 1.5 pounds and an 800-pound table. And it's sort of an encapsulation of his light-heavy dichotomy. This is Breuer with his daughter Cheska and their friend JJ on the porch. Cheska actually agreed to be in this advertisement sitting in a Cheska chair for Knoll around the same time as that other photo was taken. This is their New Canaan house, same dog. This is Kepes in the house. Anyway, these pictures are great for just showing how the spaces were used. Kepes in his studio. Party. Late night Hungarian conversations. This is Joko Borshidi and Kepes and Breuer. And then lastly, Provincetown, Saturday night, 1970. So there's a lot of just great pictures of people hanging out. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Peter beautifully laid out the origins of what happened out here. And I'm going to follow up by trying to provide some context to what happened out here. That these buildings, they're beautiful, they're here, and they're like objects in a landscape. But they're actually part of much larger conversations, which is what I find fascinating about them as a scholar of architecture, especially architecture after World War II. Peter's talk had a lot of beautiful images. You'll see my talk, I have a lot of words that I tried to squeeze in here. I look at a lot of texts and lectures and books to try and piece together the larger conversations and discussions about what people were trying to achieve about architecture at this time. And I've thought about this a lot over the years. Who would have thought that this town, Provincetown, at the end of a long, isolated peninsula that's almost impossible to get to, would be at the center of larger national and international conversations about the future direction of modern architecture. That's part of what was happening at Forum 49 in August 1949. I had never heard about this panel, to tell you the truth, until Peter reached out to me about it. But I had heard about other discussions about modern architecture at that time, and I started reading up about it, and I found that, this is part of a much larger discussion. This panel, New Directions for Modern Architecture, Forum 49. And so I was very excited about it. Here's, if you don't know, Forum 49 was a series of talks in the summer of 1949 about mostly modern art. And the so-called abstract expressionists were trying to persuade, I think, especially the Provincetown community, that abstract modern art was here and that it was important. Because in Provincetown, there was a lot of painting of the human figure, we call figurative art. And the modern artists want to really establish, the abstract expressionist modern artists really want to establish their presence. And then they also thought they would include the architects. This was the person who was organizing all this. His name was Weldon Keyes, a fascinating figure, a poet, a painter, a somewhat mysterious, enigmatic figure of that period. He came to Provincetown one summer and he organized this whole event. And there's everybody speaking, everybody together in this gallery where these talks were unfolding. And then they convened a panel about architecture. And that's mostly what I'm going to talk about. But this panel about architecture in August 1949, the title was actually the directions. It was actually Directions in 20th Century Architecture. And I realized when I thought about this panel that it was part of this larger conversation that was already underway, starting around 1948 and unfolding at the Museum of Modern Art with many of the same participants. This was like an architectural roadshow that was going on in New York, San Francisco, and in August 1949, it came to Provincetown. And the debate was really, you could break it down pretty clearly to what it was about. It was about what should modern architecture be? Should it be universal and international? Should it be based upon machines and science? And that was the viewpoint that had developed out of Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, and it got a name in the early 30s called the international style. Now, another direction for modern architecture that was brought up around this time was, should it be much more local, place-based? The word they used was regional. So should modern architecture be international, universal, or should it be regional and local and based upon local forms, vernacular architecture, materials like wood and stone? And there was this debate unfolding at this time. Now, there's a lot of crossover between these different sides. I've depicted it as a binary, an opposition. That's the way these figures, the people here, discussed it, but there's really a lot of crossover, and we see that in the houses here that are now part of the Cape Cod Modern Collection. At this at the Museum of Modern Art in February 1948, at the symposium, some of the people who would speak in Provincetown were there. Peter Blake was there. Marcel Breuer was there. I put stars by them so you can see them. This is what the Museum of Modern Art published afterwards. Sergei Chermayeff was there too. And all these people were here in Provincetown and Wellfleet as well. This conversation, the Museum of Modern Art, was really a setup where the proponents of the international style went after the proponents, the advocates of the regional architecture, with hammer and nails, you could say. And they sought to really denounce the regionalists. Breuer came out against the regionalists, and so did Peter Blake. And to better understand what this discussion was about, the regionalism debate of the late 1940s, it panned out like this. The regionalists were thought to be more American and advocating a more American-based architecture coming out of the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, which you see at the top, who was the native modernist. And that architecture really hugged the ground, got in touch with the earth, was built around boulders and rocks, used wood that was not painted, so you could see the grain of the wood that came out of the forest of Wisconsin or New England. And this developed into something called the Bay Region style around the San Francisco Bay region. And the architects who were building upon what Wright had developed were Harwell Hamilton Harris, William Worcester, people like that. And there was even an exhibition out in San Francisco curated by an American critic called Louis Mumford, advocating this type of regional architecture. And Louis Mumford, he was a well-known architecture critic in the 1940s and 50s. He wrote for The New Yorker. He was practically a public intellectual. He said, this is what modern architecture in America should be like. regional, local materials. Now, on the other side was the international style. This descends out of the European machine-based modernism of the 1920s and the 1930s. One building was Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie. It's very white. White really stood for modernism. No grain apparent in the wood. We saw Gropius's house. He paints that wood. He does not want to show you the grain. Even if he's using some local wood, he kind of abstracts it. Everything gets very formal, very geometric in the hands of the Europeans. This descends, this international style, into other works of the 1940s. When I started looking at the dates, I was pleasantly surprised to see that another really famous house of 1949 that's being completed just this year, in around that summer, was Philip Johnson's Glass House in Connecticut, a pure glass box. And Philip Johnson was the guy who coined the term international style when he was a curator at the Museum of Modern Art. Okay, so this is the debate. Should modern architecture be local and regional, local materials, or should it be international and universal? And this was replayed again and again in 1947, 48, and into 49 in the journals of architecture and art at that time. And I had done some writing and research on this in the past, and I found a whole slew of articles that were practically conversations between these people. There was another architect, Robert Woods Kennedy from Boston, who was a modern architect, and he came down on the side of modern architecture being local and regional. Now, again, his alliances were complicated. Even though he thought that modern architecture should be regional and local, he actually worked for Breuer and Gropius and liked them a lot, and he appreciated what they could do. But he came out with an article in 48, The Small House in New England, advocating a local, regional New England modernism. Philip Johnson, who coined, and Peter Blake, his lieutenant, who was at the Museum of Modern Art as well, they went after Kennedy with hammer and nails. I mean, they just went after him. And they published an article decrying Robert Wood Kennedy and this local New England modernism. They were very threatened by it, all out of proportion. There was room for everybody, but they were very antagonistic. So they went after him. And this brings in people who are going to show up here in Provincetown. Philip Johnson, I mentioned, he's a very famous architect of the period, and for decades afterwards, his glass house was his famous house. He was a curator at the Museum of Modern Art. He handed off the reins to his lieutenant, Peter Blake. And Peter Blake appeared here in Provincetown, advocating the international style once again. And then I was interested to see that there's very little written about the architecture panel at Forum 49. There was an MA thesis by Jennifer Lisa, I think that's how you say it.
Yeah.
Lisa, which is excellent, written in the early 2000s. And I read that. That was fascinating. But she only had a little bit about this architecture panel. And there's really only one document telling us what went on. And it's the Provincetown Advocate from early September 1949, reporting upon the Forum 49 panel. It's front page news. And I was really fascinated. I got the entire newspaper, actually, a digital copy of it sent to me through interlibrary loan at UMass. And their concerns in the summer of 1949 are just like ours. They're worried about a drought, and they're worried about pollution even back then. Those are the front page stories. And they're interested in modern architecture. This was a front page story. And it gives us actually quite an extensive account of what went on at the panel, and it quotes the participants. And the participants were Peter Blake. You've heard about him. And there's this little house that our Peter told us about. And this is really the way Peter Blake, Philip Johnson, and Marcel Breuer saw architecture. Form, geometry, abstraction, houses that did not touch the ground. Very unlike Wright and Robert Woods Kennedy, where houses touch the ground. They were part of nature, part of larger networks. This was a different way of looking at it. And so, he's almost playing with this little house. Anyway, Blake, he was a curator at the Museum of Modern Art. He became a very famous magazine editor, quite powerful, all through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. He knew everybody And he wrote this book, the first book about Breuer, Sun and Shadow, in 1956. So he was really an advocate of Breuer's architecture. Later on, if you want to read a good book, an interesting, gossipy book about modern architecture, his book from 1993, No Place Like Utopia, Modern Architecture and the Company We Kept, tells you the whole story about everybody at this time. So that was Blake. Then there's Breuer. Here he is again. And in summer 1949, when this panel took place in Provincetown, he had this house in the garden at the Museum of Modern Art. Museum of Modern Art back then built a series of houses in their garden out behind the museum. One was a Japanese house even, and there's a couple of modern houses. Breuer's house was probably the most famous. It got the most attention. And it was a bit surreal that you had this freestanding house in the middle of the city. And there he is, and there's the house. And in the conversation in Provincetown in August 1949, he talked about the house, and people asked a lot of questions about it. They knew what was going on. This was always a very informed community. And a lot of people, of course, had come up from New York and Boston for the summer, and they'd actually seen the house. This, too, fits into the schema of the international style. They've been trying to warm it up so it wasn't as machine-based, no longer as white-walled. Peter told us about this. They're introducing some stone, some wood. But it was still very much based upon the 1920s and 1930s European modernism. And then Breuer, of course, in summer 49, when this panel is going on, he's building his house, and there's his house. It's like an object. It's above the ground. He's exposing the wood here. So he's getting a little bit more comfortable, I think, with the American locale. And then there's Kepes, who Peter told you about. He was on the panel as well. Here's György Kepes, also a Hungarian and a refugee. And in summer 49, when this panel is taking place, Breuer is building a house very similar to his own house for Kepes, and there it is. Kepes will go on to become the founder of the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT, a very prestigious institution that did all sorts of studies of graphic design, film, modern art, but again, very geometric, very abstract, very formal, very beautiful. And he wrote this very famous book, Language of Vision. And there's Kepes there at that time as well. And then finally, Blake. And I talked about Blake. These people, what else did they have in common? They're all on this panel. They were all European refugees from Nazi Germany. And I think 2 out of 3 of them were definitely Jewish. I'm not so sure about Kepes.
Yeah, he was Jewish.
He was. So they're very tight-lipped about this. They've been through an incredible trauma. Peter Blake has changed his name. His name was not Blake. He spoke with an English accent. He was not English. He was from northern Germany. He had been sent over to England as a child as a refugee and picked up the accent, and then he never lost it because he knew it was so valuable. They were all Jewish refugees from Central Europe. They had been through a real trauma. And I think that is the background to all of this. In the conversations that we know about from the panel discussions, they consistently talk about the concerns of modern architecture, but they also talk about order and coherence. They've been through a period of great chaoticism, and so they're seeking order and coherence through architecture. They are also, let's see if I have my slides in order. I thought I had little quotes. In the article, they make it clear Blake talks the most because he was the guy who did the talking. They again repeat this that there's 3 directions for modern architecture. There's the Wrightian one, and Blake says that one is falling out of favor. That's not really true. But this was real spokesmanship for the international style and that type of modernism. Wright's type of modernism would persist. And then he really advocates Le Corbusier and the international style. And then he also talks about an anonymous architecture that could be developing, an anonymous modernism, where the buildings would just become background for people. I found that very interesting. And the buildings would be about health and a useful life. And Kepes says stuff like this too, and in the quotes from him. He talks about needing buildings that are like a sensitive instrument that will register the feelings and emotions of human life. So even though they're very formal, they're very concerned about people and their relationship to buildings. They talk about trauma and chaos a lot as well. That's all the background to all of this. And so the conversation at the panel in 1949, it's a larger offshoot of these other conversations. This is maybe the final stage in the series of unfolding conversations. So I find it interesting. Blake's coming up with this anonymous category. And I was thinking about that, how another way to look at the houses that are developing out here is that they are these kind of background stages for people and the unfolding of life. They seem to almost disappear. But then I also noted, and that's why I think that this, you can't, I've outlined these distinct categories, but it doesn't really pan out that way. All the people out here, they were borrowing from each way of making architecture. So here's another great house in the Cape Cod Modern Collection by Charles Zender from early 1970s, the Kugel Gips House. This is the most Frank Lloyd Wright style of the houses. So despite what Peter Blake's saying in Provincetown in 1949, that that's fading away, it doesn't fade away. This house is very raised above the ground and touched with the ground, uses a lot of local materials, uses the local materials. It's very engaged with its place. So what I got out of this is that in the conversation in August 1949, they are embroidering upon conversations about what the future direction of modern architecture could be. Should it be regional? Should it be international? Should it be anonymous? This is like a multiple choice test. I give tests, I'm a teacher. Is it A, B, or C, or D, all of the above? I would say it's all of the above. I'll give you the answer. And that's what I think happened out here. There was definitely a prevalence of this so-called international style architecture that lifts off the ground, barely touches it. There was a lot of that, but there was room for this as well. And I think the valuable things about these houses that we're learning about them is that though they might seem machine-inspired at first glance in many ways, they also engage with the local, and they're light on their feet, especially Weidlinger here on the left. It just lifts off the ground. It engages with the place. It does have a foundation, but it allows things to happen underneath it, nature and people and all sorts of things to unfold. And so there's a lot to be learned from these houses. They're parts of larger conversations, and we can continue thinking about them in these ways. And that's why it's important to preserve them. We can learn a lot from them. So thank you. And let's have discussion. Thank you. Thank you.